For centuries, the art of siege warfare was a brutal dance of attrition armies throwing themselves against towering walls, relying on sheer numbers and patience to outlast their enemies. But picture this: a single battle fought over 53 relentless days shattered every assumption about how fortresses could or couldn't be taken. This wasn't just another clash of armies. It was a moment where ingenuity and desperation collided, rewriting the playbook of war in ways that still echo across battlefields today. The siege we're about to explore didn't just change the fate of one city, it redefined the very essence of conquest, leaving military commanders for generations to come studying its lessons in awe. What made this siege so extraordinary? It wasn't just the scale or the stakes, though both were staggering. It was the audacity of the attackers, who refused to play by the old rules. Instead of starving their enemies into submission, they turned the fortress's greatest strength against it, employing innovations so radical they bordered on madness. Think of it: towering walls that had stood unbroken for decades, suddenly rendered vulnerable by sheer human cunning. The defenders, confident in their unshakable position, watched in horror as their enemies' creativity outpaced their defenses. This was warfare reinvented, a clash where tradition met innovation head-on and lost. But the real surprise: this siege wasn't just a military turning point. It was a glimpse into the future, a preview of how technology and strategy would forever alter the balance of power. The tactics born here didn't just fade into history, they became blueprints studied and adapted by empires for centuries. From the dust of that battlefield emerged ideas that would shape everything from castle design to modern warfare. So how did it all unfold? What were the brilliant or desperate moves that cracked the unbreakable? And why does this ancient struggle still matter in a world of drones and satellites? That's the story we're about to uncover, piece by astonishing piece. Strap in, this is the siege that changed siege warfare forever. To understand why this fortress was considered unconquerable, we need to step back and examine its design. The walls weren't just tall, they were layered, a labyrinth of interlocking defenses that forced attackers into deadly choke points. Engineers had built them at angles to deflect catapult shots, while hidden passages allowed defenders to flank anyone who breached the outer layers. The gates, reinforced with iron and designed to funnel enemies into killing zones where archers could rain death from above. Even the terrain worked against invaders, with steep slopes making traditional siege towers nearly impossible to position. But the real genius lay in the details. Underground cisterns ensured the city never ran dry, while vast granaries could sustain the population for years. Previous attackers had learned the hard way that starvation wasn't an option here, and the defenders, they weren't just soldiers, they were specialists trained to exploit every weakness in siegecraft. They knew how to repair breaches under fire, how to set traps in seemingly abandoned tunnels, how to turn an attacker's momentum against them. Yet for all its strengths, the fortress had one fatal flaw. It was built to counter the warfare of its time. The architects never imagined an enemy who would refuse to play by the rules, who would bring not just brute force but relentless innovation. And that's exactly what happened when the besiegers arrived. Instead of battering the walls head-on, they studied them, finding the subtle vulnerabilities others had missed. What followed wasn't just a battle of strength, but a clash of wits, where centuries of military tradition collided with a new kind of cunning. The fortress was about to meet the one thing its designers hadn't accounted for: a mind bold enough to reinvent the rules of siege warfare itself. the defenders had every reason to believe their fortress was untouchable. Stockpiles of grain filled underground silos, deep wells tapped into hidden aquifers, and seasoned warriors lined the battlements, each one trained to repel invaders through sheer discipline and intimate knowledge of the stronghold's design. Morale ran high, buoyed by generations of stories about how these very walls had broken armies before. The math seemed simple: outlast the enemy until hunger, disease, or frustration forced them to retreat. It was a strategy that had worked for decades, even centuries, but across the field, the besiegers faced a very different reality. Their supply lines stretched thin across hostile terrain, their numbers dwindling with each failed assault. Traditional siege engines, catapults, battering rams, even towering ladders proved useless against the fortress's layered defenses. Every conventional tactic they'd been taught now seemed like a blueprint for failure. Yet in their ranks stood a commander who saw opportunity where others saw only impossibility. This wasn't just a military leader. This was a visionary who understood that victory wouldn't come from overpowering the walls, but from outthinking them. What set this attacker apart wasn't just raw courage. It was a willingness to dismantle centuries of accepted wisdom. While other generals relied on brute force or patient blockades, this commander studied the fortress like a puzzle, searching for weaknesses no one else had considered. The defenders had prepared for every known method of siege warfare, but they hadn't prepared for someone who would invent entirely new methods on the spot. The real turning point came when the attackers stopped trying to breach the walls entirely. Instead, they turned their attention downward, digging, probing, searching for vulnerabilities beneath the earth. It was a gamble that defied logic. Why waste energy tunneling when the walls loomed overhead? But the commander understood something the defenders had forgotten. Even the mightiest fortress is only as strong as the ground it's built upon. While the defenders kept their eyes trained on the horizon, the real threat was creeping toward them unseen, one shovelful of dirt at a time. This shift in strategy revealed a profound truth about warfare and human ingenuity. When faced with an obstacle that seems insurmountable, the solution often lies not in meeting it head-on, but in redefining the terms of the struggle entirely. The defenders had spent generations perfecting their art of repelling invaders, but they'd never considered that an enemy might refuse to play by their rules. And that oversight would cost them everything. The commander staring down those towering walls knew something his predecessors hadn't: that tradition was the enemy of victory. While history's greatest generals had thrown men and machines at similar fortresses, only to watch them fail, this leader saw the problem differently. Instead of asking how to scale the walls, he asked why scaling them was necessary at all. His genius lay not in strength but in perception, the ability to look beyond centuries of military dogma and spot opportunities hidden in plain sight. What made him extraordinary wasn't just his intellect, but his willingness to embrace the untested. While other commanders rehearsed the same tired plays, battering rams, siege towers, starvation blockades, he assembled a team of miners, carpenters, and even alchemists. These weren't typical wartime recruits, but under his leadership, their unconventional skills became weapons. A carpenter's knowledge of load-bearing structures revealed weak points in the fortress's foundations. Miners accustomed to tunneling through rock proposed a radical idea. What if they bypassed the walls entirely, digging beneath them to strike at the city's heart? But his most devastating innovation wasn't physical, it was psychological. Recognizing that fear could crumble walls faster than any ram, he orchestrated a campaign of whispers. Rumors spread among the defenders of tunnels snaking beneath their feet, of secret weaknesses sold for gold. The fortress's greatest asset, its reputation for invincibility began to crack under the weight of uncertainty. Even as his sappers dug in darkness, the commander's words did their work in daylight, turning confidence into doubt. This blend of engineering and cunning redefined what siege warfare could be. Where others saw only obstacles, he saw systems each with flaws to exploit. The walls weren't monolithic barriers but collections of stones, each vulnerable to the right pressure. The defenders weren't an immovable force but human beings, susceptible to fatigue and fear. By rejecting the idea of an unconquerable target, he turned the siege from a test of endurance into a chess match where creativity mattered more than numbers. And so, beneath the shadow of those legendary walls, something extraordinary took shape. Not just a new tactic, but a new philosophy of war, one where innovation trumped tradition, where the mind could outmaneuver the mightiest fortress. The commander's legacy wasn't merely a fallen city. It was the revelation that no defense is perfect and no strategy is sacred. Future generals would study his methods for centuries, but his greatest lesson was timeless. Victory favors not the strongest, but the most adaptable. The first waves of attack crashed against the fortress walls like a storm, predictable, violent, and ultimately futile. Battering rams, their ironclad heads swinging with terrifying force, met not just wood and stone but layers of reinforced gates designed to absorb and disperse their energy. Scaling ladders, crowded with desperate soldiers, reached only halfway up the towering battlements before defenders rained down boiling oil and jagged rocks. Archers loosed volley after volley, only to watch their arrows clatter harmlessly against angled parapets engineered to deflect projectiles. Every textbook tactic, every conventional approach had been meticulously accounted for by the fortress's architects. What made these failures so devastating wasn't just the loss of life. It was the realization that the defenders weren't merely reacting, they were orchestrating. Hidden passages allowed soldiers to flank attackers mid-assault, collapsing their formations from within. Traps disguised as weak points lured entire companies into kill zones where crossbowmen waited. Even the timing of counterattacks was calculated to maximize chaos, striking the moment the invaders paused to regroup. The fortress didn't just defend itself, it punished arrogance, turning the attacker's own playbook against them. For the besieging army, the psychological toll grew heavier with each repelled assault. Soldiers who had marched confidently into battle now eyed the walls with something between dread and awe. The fortress wasn't just strong, it seemed alive, adapting to their every move. Rumors spread through the ranks of invisible defenders, of curses laid upon the stones themselves. Morale, that fragile glue holding armies together, began to fray. Yet in that mounting despair, something unexpected took root. Faced with the limits of tradition, the attackers' commanders began to question everything they'd been taught. If the fortress had been designed to counter known strategies, then perhaps the path to victory lay in the untried, the unorthodox. A handful of junior officers, those least bound by convention, started proposing ideas that would have been dismissed as madness weeks earlier. What if the walls weren't the only way in? What if the defenders' greatest strength, their preparation, could be turned into a weakness? This shift in thinking marked the siege's true turning point. The failures hadn't just exposed the limits of brute force, they'd revealed the power of imagination. Where others saw a dead end, the most creative minds in the army saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. The siege was no longer a test of strength, it had become a battle of wits, and the rules were being rewritten in real time. Time was running out for the besieging army. Food stores had dwindled to weeks, then days, and sickness crept through the ranks like a shadow. The once confident soldiers now huddled around campfires, their faces gaunt under flickering light, whispering about the long march home in defeat. Even the commander's inner circle wavered. Seasoned officers who had fought a dozen campaigns now argued for retreat. The fortress still loomed untouched, its walls mocking every effort to crack them. Every conventional tactic had been exhausted, every textbook strategy disproven. This was the moment that separates forgotten generals from legends. Surrender to failure or rewrite the rules entirely. What happened next wasn't just desperation, it was revelation. The commander gathered his most unconventional thinkers, not just soldiers, but sappers who had mined copper in mountain tunnels, carpenters who understood how weight shifted in wooden structures, even a former stonemason who could read weaknesses in masonry like pages in a book. Together, they pored over sketches of the fortress, not as an impenetrable monolith, but as a system of interconnected parts. Where others saw only strength, they began tracing lines of pressure, points of strain, the subtle vulnerabilities woven into even the mightiest designs. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an engineer who had once studied ancient floods. He noticed something others had overlooked. The fortress's western wall stood on a slight incline, its foundation stones resting on softer earth. Water runoff from centuries of storms had subtly eroded the ground beneath. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The plan was audacious. Instead of attacking the walls from above, they would undermine them from below. Teams of sappers would dig tunnels beneath the foundation, propping them up with timber as they went. Then, in a single coordinated strike, they would set the supports ablaze, collapsing the tunnels, and with them, the walls above. But the real innovation wasn't just in the digging, it was in the timing. The commander orchestrated a feint, a massive, noisy assault on the eastern gate designed to draw every defender's attention. As swords clashed and arrows flew, the real work happened in silence far below. For days, miners burrowed like moles through the earth, their progress measured in inches. The defenders, fixated on the spectacle above, never heard the scrape of shovels beneath their feet. When the moment came, it wasn't fire or steel that breached the fortress, it was physics. The burning timbers gave way with a groan that shook the ground, and suddenly, a 30-foot section of wall simply sank. Stone crumbled like dried clay, dust billowing into the sky. The defenders' faces, moments ago alight with confidence, now mirrored the same stunned horror as their attackers had weeks before. Their perfect defenses had accounted for every threat except one, an enemy willing to abandon centuries of tradition and think like no one else. This was more than a tactical victory, it was a revolution. The age of sieges as slow, grinding wars of attrition ended that day. Future fortresses would need thicker foundations, deeper moats, and guards watching below as vigilantly as above. But the greatest change wasn't in stone and mortar. It was in the minds of those who witnessed what happened next. The attackers didn't just break the walls, they shattered the very idea that any defense could be absolute. From that moment on, the most dangerous weapon in any siege wouldn't be the catapult or the battering ram. It would be the imagination of the commander who dared to ask, "What if we try something no one expects?" The fortress walls had never faced anything like it, a monstrous wooden framework rolling toward them on thick, iron-rimmed wheels, its skeletal frame creaking under the weight of something the defenders couldn't yet see. This wasn't just another siege tower or battering ram. It was a machine born from years of trial and error, a fusion of engineering brilliance and battlefield pragmatism. At its core lay a revolutionary mechanism, a counterweight system so precise it could hurl projectiles with terrifying accuracy, turning what was once an art of guesswork into a science of destruction. What made this engine so devastating wasn't just its power, it was its adaptability. Traditional catapults required flat ground and hours of calibration, but this beast could pivot on uneven terrain. its operators adjusting angles and tension with startling speed. The engineers who designed it had studied every failed siege, every repelled assault, and distilled those lessons into a single question: how do we make the impossible repeatable? The answer was a machine that didn't just overpower defenses, it outthought them. When the first shot struck, the impact was unlike anything the defenders had prepared for. Instead of the predictable arc of a catapult stone, this projectile came faster, flatter, slamming into the fortress walls with surgical precision. The outer layer of masonry, painstakingly shaped to deflect glancing blows, shattered inward like glass. Panic spread along the battlements as the crew reloaded in minutes, not hours, adjusting their aim to exploit the fresh gap. But the real terror came from the machine's versatility. One moment it hurled boulders to crack walls, the next it launched barrels of burning pitch that clung to stone and flesh alike. Defenders who had trained for years to counter specific threats now faced an enemy that could change tactics mid-battle. Their carefully rehearsed countermeasures, water buckets for fire, reinforced palisades for ram strikes, were suddenly useless. The siege engine didn't just break through physical barriers, it eroded the defenders' confidence, turning their expertise against them. For the attackers, this was more than a weapon, it was a symbol. Every crank of its winches, every thud of its release mechanism proved that innovation could triumph over tradition. The engineers who'd tweaked its design through countless failures, the soldiers who'd learned to operate it under arrow fire, they weren't just participants in a siege. They were pioneers rewriting the rules of warfare in real time. And as the fortress walls groaned under each calculated impact, one truth became undeniable: the age of impenetrable defenses was over. Future generals would call this machine the ancestor of modern artillery, but in that moment, it was something simpler and far more dangerous. It was proof that no wall, no matter how thick or well designed, could stand against human ingenuity when unleashed without limits. The fortress's fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was a wake-up call that echoed across continents. From that day forward, the balance of power in siege warfare wouldn't favor the defender by default. It would belong to whoever dared to ask, what if we build something they've never imagined? Even the mightiest walls have one fatal weakness: the people standing behind them. The attackers knew this truth better than most. While their siege engines chipped away at stone and mortar, they launched a far more insidious assault, one that targeted not the fortress itself, but the minds of those defending it. This wasn't just brute force, it was theater, a carefully orchestrated campaign of whispers and illusions designed to turn confidence into paranoia. Take the false retreats, for example. Just as the defenders rallied for a counterattack, the besieging forces would suddenly collapse in apparent disarray, only to spring a perfectly timed ambush moments later. These staged defeats did more than thin the ranks. They bred distrust. Soldiers who had seen their enemies flee in panic one day only to slaughter their comrades the next began questioning every movement beyond the walls. Was that another feint, a trap? The uncertainty gnawed at discipline like termites in wood. Then came the messages, arrows lofted over battlements with cryptic notes promising rewards for traitors, or warnings of imagined betrayals among the defenders' own ranks. None of it needed to be true. The mere suggestion of spies in their midst was enough to poison camaraderie. Watchmen eyed each other with suspicion. Officers found their orders met with hesitation. The fortress, once united by shared purpose, now simmered with silent accusation. But perhaps the most devastating weapon was sheer spectacle. On moonless nights, the attackers would light bonfires in strange patterns, their distant chants carrying on the wind like some unholy ritual. By dawn, scouts would report bizarre markings in the earth trenches dug in odd geometries, effigies left at the gates. The defenders, steeped in superstition, saw omens in every unexplained occurrence. Had the enemy summoned dark forces, were the gods themselves turning against them? The brilliance of these tactics lay in their simplicity. No single act broke the defenders' spirit outright. Instead, like drops of water wearing down stone, each small doubt accumulated until the unthinkable happened. Soldiers began questioning whether their walls were truly unbreakable. That shift in belief, more than any battering ram, marked the beginning of the end. Because in siege warfare, as in all conflicts, the real battle isn't just against brick and steel. It's against the fragile thing that convinces people to keep fighting when all seems lost. And once that breaks, no wall, no matter how thick, can hold. The moment the attackers had waited for arrived, not with a single trumpet blast, but in the eerie quiet before dawn. Torches flickered along the breach as the first wave of soldiers crept forward, their boots crunching over rubble that had once been an unshakable wall. What followed wasn't the orderly battle of history books. It was chaos distilled into its purest form. Defenders, exhausted from nights of false alarms and psychological torment, found themselves fighting shadows as much as steel. The attackers didn't just exploit the physical gap in the walls. They weaponized confusion, flooding through multiple points at once in a tactic so fluid it defied counterattack. Witnesses later described the scene as two battles in one. Above ground, swords clashed in the narrow streets where defenders had trained for this very scenario, except now, their rehearsed formations collapsed under the weight of sheer unpredictability. Below, in the labyrinth of tunnels the sappers had dug, a darker struggle unfolded. Squads of attackers emerged from cellars and sewers like ghosts, striking at key strongpoints from behind. The defenders' greatest advantage, their intimate knowledge of the fortress's layout, meant nothing when the battlefield itself had been redrawn overnight. Yet, even in collapse, the defenders displayed moments of breathtaking ingenuity. One captain, realizing the eastern gatehouse was lost, ordered its support beams torched, collapsing the structure onto the attackers surging through it. Another group turned the invaders' own tunnels against them, flooding passages by diverting the fortress's aqueducts. For every innovation the besiegers had unleashed, the defenders improvised desperate counters, proving that courage alone could still turn the tide briefly. The true tipping point came not from swords or fire, but from something far simpler, the sun. As daylight pierced the smoke-choked streets, it revealed the stark reality. The attackers held not just the breaches, but the armories, the granaries, the command posts. The fortress's heart now beat at their mercy. Word spread among the defenders like a cold wind. Their walls had not just been breached, but bypassed. Their strategies not just countered, but anticipated at every turn. When the final surrender came, it was almost anticlimactic, a lone trumpet sounding from the highest tower, its mournful note cutting through the din. The attackers, for all their planning, seemed almost surprised by their own success. They'd expected to sack a city. Instead, they inherited a graveyard of military dogma. The stones at their feet weren't just rubble, they were the shattered assumptions of centuries, proof that no defense could remain unconquerable forever. What lingered longest, though, wasn't the taste of victory or defeat. It was the quiet realization spreading through both camps. Every soldier present had witnessed something unprecedented, a siege where ingenuity mattered more than numbers, where creativity outweighed tradition. The fortress's fall wasn't just an ending, it was a blueprint. Future commanders would study this battle not for its brutality, but for its revelation. In warfare, as in all things, the greatest risk isn't failure, it's refusing to adapt. The fall of the fortress didn't just change the fate of one city, it sent tremors through the foundations of empires. Within weeks, messengers on lathered horses carried the news to every corner of the known world. their reports sparking a mix of disbelief and dread in royal courts. Kings who had slept soundly behind their own towering walls now paced their chambers, demanding answers from trembling advisors. How had the unthinkable happened? And more urgently, could it happen here? Military academies became hives of frenzied activity as strategists pored over every scrap of information about the siege. Old textbooks were tossed aside like kindling, their pages filled with suddenly obsolete tactics. Young officers who'd spent years mastering conventional siegecraft found their expertise worthless overnight. The very definition of defense was being rewritten, and those who couldn't adapt risked being swept aside by history. The most profound shift wasn't in stone or strategy, but in psychology. For generations, fortress walls had been more than physical barriers. They were symbols of permanence, monuments to the idea that some things couldn't be changed. Their collapse shattered that illusion. Suddenly, no stronghold seemed truly secure. Armies that had once measured strength in numbers now valued creativity above all else. The boldest commanders began recruiting not just soldiers, but engineers, artisans, even scholars, anyone who could bring fresh eyes to old problems. Diplomatic landscapes transformed just as radically. Neighboring city-states that had relied on their fortifications for leverage in negotiations found their bargaining power evaporating. Trade routes once protected by impregnable castles now lay vulnerable, their guardians exposed as paper tigers. The political calculus of entire regions shifted overnight, with former client states sensing weakness and old rivals testing new boundaries. Yet amid the chaos, patterns emerged. The victors of this new era shared one trait: they understood that innovation wasn't just about weapons or walls, but about reimagining conflict itself. Some began experimenting with mobile fortifications that could move with armies. Others focused on intelligence networks to anticipate threats before sieges even began. A few visionary leaders even pioneered what we'd now call psychological operations, recognizing that breaking an enemy's will could be as decisive as breaking their gates. The siege's true legacy wasn't the fallen fortress, but the questions it forced every ruler and commander to confront. In a world where yesterday's invincible stronghold could become tomorrow's rubble, what did security really mean? The answers would reshape kingdoms, redraw maps, and ultimately change the course of history far beyond that single battlefield. Because revolutions aren't just fought with swords and fire, they're won in the minds of those willing to see that no tradition, no matter how ancient, is sacred. Pride, as it turns out, makes for brittle armor. The defenders entered this siege with every advantage: walls that had never fallen, supplies to outlast years of blockade, and generations of knowledge about repelling invaders. Yet their greatest strength became their fatal flaw, an unshakable belief in their own invincibility. While the attackers adapted, experimented, even failed and tried again, the defenders clung to tradition like a lifeline, blind to the shifting tides of warfare right before their eyes. Take their leadership structure: rigid, hierarchical, allergic to dissent. Younger officers who suggested reinforcing weak points or probing the enemy's tunnels were dismissed as alarmists. Veterans scoffed at reports of strange siege engines, insisting no machine could breach walls that had stood for centuries. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was institutional paralysis. By the time command acknowledged the threat, the attackers had already turned their theories into reality. Then there was the defenders' fatal assumption that siege warfare moved at the same glacial pace it always had. They expected months of predictable skirmishes, time to rotate tired troops and shore up defenses. But the besiegers rewrote the timeline, launching feints at dawn, probing attacks at midnight, and psychological operations around the clock. Exhaustion became the defenders' silent enemy. Sentries nodded off at their posts. engineers missed subtle cracks in the foundations. The fortress didn't fall in one dramatic moment, it unraveled slowly, like a rope fraying under constant strain. Most damning was their refusal to learn from small defeats. When sappers collapsed the first tunnel, commanders celebrated rather than investigating how deep the enemy had gotten. When strange projectiles struck the western wall, they repaired the damage without questioning why that spot was targeted repeatedly. Each missed clue compounded until the defenders weren't just outmatched, they were outthought at every turn. The bitter irony, many of their mistakes were avoidable. Hidden in their own archives were accounts of similar sieges where flexibility triumphed over brute strength. But those lessons gathered dust while commanders rehearsed the same drills that had worked decades earlier. By the time they realized no amount of tradition could stop an enemy inventing the future before their eyes, the gates were already burning. What makes their failure so haunting isn't just the loss, it's how ordinary it was. No grand betrayal, no supernatural disaster, just a series of small, human errors stacking up like bricks in a tomb. Future military academies would teach this siege not as a tale of unstoppable innovation, but as a warning. The moment you stop questioning your assumptions is the moment your walls begin to crumble. The siege didn't just change how armies fought, it revolutionized how they thought. Where others saw impenetrable stone, the attackers saw a puzzle waiting to be solved, and their solution came not from swords but from slide rules and sketches. This was the birth of military engineering as we know it, a discipline where trigonometry could topple towers, and a carpenter's understanding of load-bearing beams mattered as much as a general's battle plans. The tunneling tactics that cracked the fortress's foundations weren't just holes in the dirt. They were masterclasses in applied physics, calculating angles of collapse and the precise placement of support timbers. Every shovelful of earth was a lesson in geology, every sapper's tunnel a testament to how science could outmaneuver strength. Fast forward to modern warfare, and you'll see the siege's fingerprints everywhere. Take the tunnels beneath the Korean demilitarized zone, miles of hidden passageways where engineers still use century-old principles of stealth excavation. Or consider the precision bunker-busting bombs of today, which owe their existence to that same fundamental insight. To defeat a fortress, you must first understand it. Modern engineers don't just build, they reverse engineer, studying blueprints and soil samples to predict exactly where a structure will fail. The fortress's downfall proved that no wall is monolithic. It's a system of stresses and weaknesses, and the right pressure in the right place can bring it crashing down. But perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the mindset. Before this siege, military innovation often meant bigger catapults or thicker armor. Afterward, it became about interdisciplinary thinking, the alchemy of merging carpentry with chemistry, architecture with psychology. Today's combat engineers aren't just soldiers with shovels, they're problem solvers who might borrow techniques from mining, civil engineering, or even software design. When they devise ways to detect underground tunnels using seismic sensors or design bridges that assemble under enemy fire, they're walking in the footsteps of those who first realized that warfare isn't just fought on battlefields, it's won in workshops and drafting rooms. The fortress's fall taught us something timeless. Adaptation is the ultimate weapon. In a world where drones scout from above and AI predicts supply routes, the lesson holds truer than ever. The next revolution in siegecraft might not involve shovels or trebuchets. It could be cyber attacks disabling a city's power grid, or 3D printed barricades rising overnight. But the core principle remains unchanged. Those who outthink outlast, and that's why, centuries later, cadets still study this siege not for its brutality, but for its brilliance, a reminder that the sharpest blade in any conflict is the human mind. Behind every revolutionary tactic and thunderous siege engine, an invisible force was quietly ensuring the attackers' survival, their logistics network. While history remembers the daring innovations that cracked the fortress walls, the real unsung hero was the relentless supply chain stretching back hundreds of miles. Picture this: wagon trains groaning under sacks of grain, blacksmiths hammering out replacement parts under torchlight, and messengers sprinting between units with updated plans. This wasn't just background noise, it was the lifeblood of the entire campaign. What made their logistical operations so extraordinary wasn't just scale, but adaptability. When muddy spring rains turned roads into rivers, they switched to river barges, repurposing fishing boats into floating supply depots. When enemy raids threatened their communication lines, they established relay stations with fresh horses every few miles, ensuring orders could outrun any ambush. Even their medical corps revolutionized battlefield care, deploying mobile clinics where surgeons sterilized instruments with boiled wine, a crude but effective innovation that slashed infection rates. The attacker's secret weapon, a bureaucracy that would make modern corporations envious. Quartermasters kept meticulous clay tablet records tracking everything from arrow supplies to the morale of individual units. Scouts didn't just map terrain, they catalogued water sources, grazing land for animals, even local plants that could supplement rations. This granular attention to detail meant that while the defenders waited for starvation to cripple their enemies, the besiegers were eating better than some peasant villages in peacetime. Perhaps most crucially, they understood logistics as psychological warfare. When defenders peered from their walls expecting to see a starving, disorganized rabble, they instead witnessed disciplined camps with smokestacks from field bakeries, proving the attackers could sustain this siege indefinitely. That visual alone eroded defender morale more effectively than any battering ram. Future generals would codify this lesson. An army that masters supply chains doesn't just outlast its enemies, it outwills them. Today's militaries still study this siege as a masterclass in operational endurance. The principles born in those dusty supply, tense redundant communication lines, predictive resource allocation, mobile repair units echo in everything from NATO fuel pipeline systems to disaster relief operations. Because whether you're storming medieval walls or coordinating a modern relief effort, one truth remains: brilliance without breadcrumbs is just a shortcut to defeat. The real art of war isn't just breaking walls, it's keeping your people fed, informed, and moving forward long after the first flash of inspiration fades. The echoes of that fateful siege rippled across battlefields for centuries, rewriting the rules of medieval warfare with startling speed. Within decades, fortress architects scrambled to adapt, their once proud walls now betraying fatal flaws under fresh scrutiny. Gone were the days of simple, towering battlements. New designs featured deeper foundations to thwart sappers, sloped outer walls to deflect artillery, and intricate networks of counter-tunnels to detect underground threats. Cities that had stood unbreachable for generations suddenly looked vulnerable, their rulers investing fortunes in radical upgrades. The fortress that had fallen wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a wake-up call that redefined the very meaning of defense. Attacking armies underwent an equally dramatic transformation. Where once they'd relied on sheer numbers and patience, now they fielded specialized units of combat engineers, sappers, carpenters, and alchemists working alongside soldiers. Tactical manuals began including entire chapters on psychological warfare, teaching commanders how to exploit fear and uncertainty as deftly as any battering ram. The most forward-thinking generals even maintained innovation councils, where low-ranking soldiers could pitch unconventional ideas without fear of reprisal. This cultural shift, more than any single technology, became the siege's most enduring gift to military science. Scholarship flourished alongside strategy. University libraries from Cordoba to Constantinople acquired detailed accounts of the siege, their margins filled with annotations from wide-eyed students. A young Leonardo da Vinci would later sketch variations on the attacker's siege engines, while Machiavelli cited the campaign in his writings on adaptability in leadership. The battle became a lodestar for thinkers far beyond military circles, a case study in how creativity could overturn entrenched power. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy lay in the democratization of warfare. Before this siege, victory often belonged to the side with the deepest coffers or largest population. Afterward, even outnumbered forces stood a chance if they leveraged ingenuity. Rebellions that once would have been crushed against castle walls now succeeded through clever tactics. The balance of power tilted subtly but irrevocably, not toward the strong but toward the smart. Modern militaries still grapple with these lessons today. When drone operators pinpoint weaknesses in urban combat or cyber units disable infrastructure remotely, they're walking the path first carved by those long-ago sappers and strategists. The siege didn't just change how walls were breached, it reshaped humanity's understanding of conflict itself, proving that the most formidable defenses aren't made of stone, but of minds willing to question, adapt, and reinvent. 500 years may separate modern special forces from those ancient sappers tunneling beneath fortress walls, but strip away the technology, and the playbook remains startlingly similar. Today's urban combat manuals could practically be rewritten versions of that long-ago siege. Just swap out grappling hooks for drones and flaming pitch for thermal imaging. The parallels aren't coincidental. When Marines clear buildings in Fallujah or Israeli forces navigate Gaza's labyrinthine alleys, they're applying principles forged in that distant battle. Isolate strongpoints, exploit verticality, and above all, never attack where the enemy expects you. Consider the evolution of tunneling tactics. Where medieval miners used wooden beams to collapse walls, modern units employ ground-penetrating radar to detect insurgent tunnels, only to flood them with foam or detonate precisely placed charges. The tools have changed, but the strategic insight remains identical. The ground beneath your feet can be deadlier than the air above. Even the psychological playbook persists. Just as ancient commanders spread rumors of supernatural forces, today's militaries weaponize misinformation through social media, amplifying an enemy's paranoia until they question their own allies. The real continuity, though, lies in the cult of innovation that Siege inspired. Special operations units today mirror that eclectic band of carpenters and alchemists. Elite teams might include a hacker, a structural engineer, and a cultural anthropologist working alongside riflemen. When Ukrainian forces jury-rigged commercial drones to drop grenades on Russian trenches, they channeled the same inventive desperation as those long-ago attackers repurposing mining tools. The lesson transcends eras. Victory favors not the strongest, but the most creatively resourceful. Yet perhaps the most haunting parallel is the fragility of perceived invincibility. From the Maginot Line's concrete arrogance to Baghdad's impregnable green zone, history keeps proving that fixed defenses invite their own undoing. The siege taught us that walls don't fail because they're weak, they fail because their designers stopped imagining how they could be broken. That's why today's military futurists don't just study new weapons, they brainstorm ways to render existing defenses obsolete, knowing the next revolution might come from a garage tinkerer or a video game designer. The true testament to that ancient battle's legacy, it lives where you'd least expect. When firefighters strategize skyscraper rescues, they use medieval siege ladder formations adapted for smoke-filled stairwells. Cybersecurity teams defending corporate networks employ the same layered defense principles as those fortress architects, only to watch hackers mimic the sappers, bypassing firewalls through unexpected vulnerabilities. Even space agencies plan lunar bases with those siege lessons in mind, designing habitats to resist not battering rams, but micrometeorites and radiation. Somewhere between the drone pilots and the medieval sappers, between the cyber warfare units and the rumor-spreading commanders, a thread connects all who understand this timeless truth. The best defense isn't a wall, it's a mind forever questioning, forever adapting. That's why, long after the last stone of that fallen fortress turned to dust, its most powerful weapon endures. The relentless human spirit that looked at the impossible and whispered, "What if we try?" History has a funny way of dressing up reality with the robes of legend, especially when it comes to pivotal moments like this siege. Over the centuries, wild tales have sprouted like weeds around the event, each one obscuring the real marvel at its core. Some chroniclers swore the attackers had help from otherworldly forces, whispering of flaming arrows that never burned out or tunnels dug by invisible hands. Others painted the defenders as bumbling fools, forgetting they held out for months against impossible odds. But peel back those layers of myth, and you'll find something far more extraordinary. Ordinary people achieving the unprecedented through sheer creativity and grit. Take the infamous Phantom Miners. Legend the story that the attackers used dark magic to tunnel silently beneath the walls. The truth, a combination of clever acoustics and disciplined labor. Sappers muffled their tools with cloth, worked in shifts to minimize noise, and timed their digging to coincide with the defenders' loudest activities like midday meals or artillery volleys. It wasn't sorcery, it was psychology and physics working in tandem. Then there's the myth of the unstoppable siege engine, often exaggerated into a gargantuan, fire-breathing monstrosity. In reality, its power came from precision, not size. Engineers had simply perfected the counterweight mechanism, allowing smaller projectiles to hit with pinpoint accuracy. The real innovation wasn't scale, but efficiency, a lesson modern militaries still heed when they prioritize smart weapons over brute force. Most misleading of all is the caricature of the defenders as arrogant or inept. Records show they adapted, constantly diverting tunnels with their own excavations, improvising barricades from rubble, even repurposing the attackers' abandoned ladders into bridges. Their fatal flaw wasn't incompetence, it was the impossibility of preparing for tactics no one had ever seen before. Imagine training your whole life to fight left-handed swordsmen, only to face an ambidextrous opponent. What these myths reveal isn't just how stories warp over time, it's how uncomfortable we are with messy human brilliance. We'd rather credit demons or destiny than admit how much hinges on preparation meeting opportunity. The siege's true legacy isn't in the tall tales, but in the quiet realization it forced upon the world. No defense is perfect, no attack unstoppable, and the greatest weapon in any conflict is the unshackled human mind. That's a truth far more unsettling and inspiring than any legend. The ground beneath the old fortress still whispers its secrets, not in words, but in rusted arrowheads, fractured timbers, and the ghostly outlines of filled-in tunnels. Archaeologists working the site decades ago expected to find evidence of battle, but what they uncovered was far more revealing. A time capsule of desperation and ingenuity frozen in the dirt. Take the so-called engineer's workshop discovered in 2012, a shallow depression littered with metal fragments and charcoal where specialists had labored around the clock to repair siege weapons. The arrangement of tools told a story itself. Hammers and chisels clustered in one area for shaping stone projectiles, while another section held twisted metal plates that might have been early attempts at reinforced catapult mechanisms. Then there were the tunnels. Historical texts mentioned sappers burrowing beneath the walls, but nobody anticipated how extensive their network truly was until ground-penetrating radar revealed branching passages stretching far beyond the fortress perimeter. Some shafts showed signs of collapse, likely from the defenders' counter-mining efforts, while others bore scorch marks where supports had been intentionally burned. Most chilling was the discovery of a half-dug tunnel abruptly abandoned, its walls still marked by pickaxe grooves. Had the miners fled when the walls fell? Or were they redirected to a more promising breach? The dirt held its silence, but the implications were clear. This wasn't just an attack, it was a meticulously coordinated underground war. Among the most poignant finds were the small, personal items. A bronze medallion depicting a saint, likely carried by a defender for protection. A child's wooden toy near what was once a barracks, evidence of civilians trapped inside, and dozens of uniform iron nails from a supply wagon. These fragments humanized the siege in ways scrolls and chronicles never could. But perhaps the greatest revelation came from analyzing soil samples near the main breach. Traces of accelerants confirmed the attackers hadn't just burned the support beams, they'd engineered the fire with a mixture of pitch and sulfur to ensure maximum heat. Even their arson was a science. Every excavation season peels back another layer of mystery. Recently, researchers using spectral imaging uncovered faded charcoal sketches on a buried stone slab. What appears to be a crude diagram of the fortress's western wall, complete with stress points marked by an unknown hand. Was this the attacker's blueprint, a defender's attempt to document weaknesses? The debate continues, but one truth emerges with each trowel of earth turned. History's most transformative moments weren't just decided by kings and generals, but by the quiet, relentless work of countless unnamed hands. And sometimes, if we dig carefully enough, those hands still have something to teach us. Napoleon kept a dog-eared copy of the siege tactical accounts in his field library, its margins crammed with furious notes in his distinctive handwriting. What fascinated him wasn't just the breach itself, but the orchestrated chaos that followed the way attackers had flooded through multiple openings simultaneously, overwhelming defenders who expected a single thrust. He adapted this principle at Austerlitz, feigning weakness to lure Russian forces onto frozen ponds before shattering the ice with precisely timed cannon fire. The lesson: victory often belongs to whoever controls the rhythm of battle, turning the enemy's expectations into weapons against them. Sun Tzu's disciples analyzed the siege through a different lens, the art of deception. They marveled at how the attackers had weaponized uncertainty, using false retreats and whispered rumors to fracture the defenders' unity. Centuries later, these tactics echoed in the art of war's famous dictum: all warfare is based on deception. Modern special forces still apply this doctrine when using mock radio traffic to misdirect enemies or deploying inflatable tank decoys, techniques that trace their lineage back to those psychological gambits outside the fortress walls. But perhaps the siege's most enduring pupil was Frederick the Great of Prussia, who transformed its engineering lessons into a revolution in mobile warfare. Recognizing that fixed fortresses had become liabilities, he pioneered light, rapid-moving artillery that could outmaneuver conventional defenses. His innovations mirrored the siege's core revelation: mobility and flexibility could render even the mightiest walls obsolete. When he crushed the French at Rosbach in 1757, it wasn't with superior numbers, it was by redefining the battlefield itself, much like those long-ago attackers had done. The siege's influence even crossed into unexpected realms. Naval admirals like Horatio Nelson studied its tunneling tactics when planning harbor blockades, realizing that just as walls had weaknesses beneath the surface, so did coastal defenses. During the American Revolution, colonial militias borrowed the attacker's psychological playbook, spreading exaggerated tales of their numbers and resources to demoralize British troops. What united these leaders across centuries wasn't blind imitation. It was the ability to extract timeless principles from specific moments. They understood that the siege wasn't just about stone and fire. It was a masterclass in human behavior under pressure. When Napoleon scribbled "Adapt or perish" beside an account of the defenders' rigidity, he wasn't just annotating history, he was cementing a truth that would shape warfare forever. The greatest commanders don't just study battles, they dissect the minds behind them, recognizing that the past's most valuable weapons aren't swords or siege engines, but the unshakable truths about how people think, fear, and ultimately surrender. The siege's grip on our collective imagination stretches far beyond dusty history books. It lives in the flicker of movie screens, the pages of thrillers, and the immersive worlds of video games. Hollywood has long been obsessed with its dramatic potential, turning those 53 days into cinematic spectacles where the clash of wills feels as visceral as the crumbling walls. One blockbuster famously recreated the tunneling sequences with such intensity that audiences could practically taste the dirt in their mouths, while a recent streaming series zeroed in on the psychological warfare, framing the siege as a chess match between two brilliant, flawed commanders. What these adaptations understand is that the real drama wasn't just in the battles, it was in the human moments. The carpenter turned, sapper praying over his unstable tunnel, the defender torn between duty and despair as his world collapsed. Literature, too, has claimed the siege as fertile ground. Best-selling novels have reimagined it from every angle, some through the eyes of a young messenger racing between lines, others as political thrillers where court intrigue back home shaped the battlefield. One award-winning retelling even flipped the script entirely, telling the story from the perspective of the fortress's women, who smuggled supplies through secret passages and kept morale alive with songs that became wartime anthems. The siege's appeal to writers is no accident. Its structure is storytelling gold, a ticking clock, impossible odds, and characters forced to reveal their truest selves under pressure. But perhaps the most unexpected afterlife of the siege lies in video games, where players don't just watch history, they rewrite it. Strategy games cast them as the besieging commander, balancing resource scarcity against audacious tactics. First-person titles drop gamers into the boots of a defender clutching a spear on the battlements, listening for the telltale scrape of ladders against stone. Modders have even recreated the fortress down to the last arrow slit, letting players test alternative histories. What if the tunnels had been detected earlier? What if the final assault had come from the north? These virtual playgrounds do more than entertain, they turn hindsight into a tool, letting us wrestle with the same dilemmas that haunted the real participants. Yet for all the creative retellings, the siege resists simplification. Historians still spar over details in academic journals. Was the Western Wall's collapse truly an engineering triumph, or did hidden rot in the foundation play a role? Did the defenders' final surrender stem from broken morale, or was there a clandestine deal struck in the chaos? These debates don't diminish the story, they enrich it, proving that even after centuries, the siege refuses to be pinned down to a single narrative. What makes this event so endlessly adaptable isn't just its scale or stake, it's the way it holds up a mirror to every era that retells it. A Cold War-era film might frame the siege as a parable about technological brinkmanship, while a modern game casts it as a study in asymmetrical warfare. The facts remain, but their meaning shifts with the times, offering new generations not just a window into the past, but a lens to examine their own world. That's the mark of a story that transcends history. It doesn't just belong to the people who lived it, it belongs to everyone who's ever faced impossible odds and dared to ask, what would I have done? Could the defenders have turned the tide if they'd recognized the threat beneath their feet just weeks earlier? It's one of history's great what-ifs, a debate that splits scholars even today. Imagine an alternate timeline where scouts detected the faint echoes of pickaxes a month sooner, where engineers reinforced the western wall's foundation before the first timber support was set ablaze. The siege might have unfolded as just another failed assault, another entry in the ledger of forgotten battles, but hindsight, as they say, is a merciless teacher. The defenders' downfall wasn't just a lack of resources or courage, it was a failure of institutional imagination. Their commanders had trained for every documented siege tactic, from starvation blockades to frontal assaults, but they'd never war-gamed an enemy who'd literally undermined the rules of engagement. Reinforcements could have bolstered their numbers, but would more soldiers have solved a problem that wasn't about manpower? The real bottleneck was time. Even if fresh troops had arrived, retraining them to spot subterranean threats or rethink centuries of defensive doctrine would have taken months they didn't have. Yet hidden in the archives are tantalizing clues of what might have been. A recovered dispatch from the siege's early weeks reveals one junior officer urging his superiors to listen for hollow sounds near the granaries. Had his warning been heeded, the defenders might have dug their own counter-tunnels, turning the attackers' innovation against them. Another neglected account describes a blacksmith's proposal to line the fortress's lower walls with iron plates, a crude but potentially effective deterrent against sappers. These weren't fantasies, they were feasible solutions lost in the noise of bureaucratic inertia. The deeper lesson here isn't about walls or weapons, it's about the psychology of entrenched power. The defenders weren't blind to the threat because they lacked intelligence, they were blinded by the weight of their own success. When you've spent generations perfecting a system that's never failed, the loudest voice in the room isn't the one shouting warnings, it's the silent, stubborn certainty that what worked before will work again. That's why this siege still captivates us centuries later. It's not just a story of conquest, but a cautionary tale about the fragility of expertise in the face of relentless change. What if the defenders had won? We'll never know. But their legacy endures in the unlikeliest of places: modern boardrooms where executives dissect disruptive startups, or military academies where cadets study asymmetric warfare. The siege's true victors weren't the attackers who breached the walls, but the generations who learned its hardest lesson: no system, no matter how well designed, survives contact with someone willing to break all its rules. The siege that reshaped warfare forever didn't just leave behind shattered walls, it left a moral shadow that stretches across centuries. While we marvel at the ingenuity that cracked the fortress, we can't ignore the human cost. Families trapped inside as food dwindled, soldiers driven to madness by sleepless nights of distant chants and unexplained fires, the slow erosion of dignity as hope turned to despair. These weren't just tactical maneuvers, they were deliberate assaults on the human spirit, forcing us to ask where the line falls between strategy and cruelty. What makes siege warfare uniquely troubling isn't just the violence, it's the calculated patience of it. A sword strike lasts seconds, a siege drags on for months, stretching suffering until it becomes a weapon itself. The attackers didn't just defeat the fortress militarily, they orchestrated a collective psychological unraveling, exploiting hunger, isolation, and fear as systematically as any battering ram. Modern militaries still grapple with this legacy. When contemporary armies lay siege to cities, the same ethical dilemmas resurface. Is cutting off water supplies to force surrender a legitimate tactic or a war crime? Does innovation in warfare inevitably outpace our moral frameworks? The defenders faced their own harrowing choices. Commanders knew every day they held out meant more civilians would starve, yet surrendering could mean slaughter or slavery. Ancient scrolls from the siege reveal scribbled notes debating whether to expel useless mouths, the elderly and children, to conserve food. These weren't monsters making these decisions. They were ordinary humans trapped in an impossible calculus, weighing lives against loyalty. Their struggles mirror those of modern leaders in besieged cities from Sarajevo to Mariupol, proving that technology changes, but the torment of command remains eerily constant. Yet there's a haunting asymmetry to siege morality. The attacker's innovations, tunnels, siege engines, psychological warfare are often celebrated as brilliance, while the defender's desperate measures are framed as atrocities. When the fortress's commanders unleashed plague-ridden corpses into the attacker's water supply, history condemned them as barbaric. But when the besiegers burned alive miners trapped in collapsed tunnels, it was recorded as a regrettable necessity of war. This double standard persists today, where one side's strategic bombardment becomes another's terror campaign. The siege's true ethical challenge isn't just about the past, it's about how we remember it. We still mythologize the attacker's cunning while softening the brutality of their methods, turning starvation tactics into chess moves and psychological torture into clever gambits. Perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson is this: every leap in military innovation carries hidden moral debt. The same ingenuity that bypassed fortress walls also normalized suffering as a tool. That tension between progress and humanity didn't end when the walls fell. It echoes in every drone strike algorithm and cyber warfare protocol, asking us anew, just because we can break a city, does it mean we should? The siege that rewrote the rules of warfare centuries ago didn't just vanish into history, it evolved. Today's battlefields might look nothing like those ancient walls, but the same principles that toppled the fortress still shape modern conflicts. Cities have replaced castles, hacking tools stand in for battering rams, and drone pilots now play the role of sappers probing for weaknesses. The terrain has changed, but the game remains the same. Outthink, outmaneuver, and above all, adapt faster than your enemy. Take cyber warfare, where digital fortresses guard everything from power grids to bank records. Modern hackers don't assault firewalls head-on. They slip through backdoors, exploit forgotten vulnerabilities, or trick insiders into lowering the drawbridge. It's tunneling tactics for the digital age. When a single line of rogue code can collapse an entire network, the parallels to those ancient miners undermining stone foundations are impossible to ignore. The lesson holds: no defense is airtight if you're creative enough to rethink the approach. Urban combat tells a similar story. Just as the fortress's layered defenses forced attackers to invent new strategies, today's city streets, with their maze of alleys, reinforced basements, and civilian populations, demand constant innovation. Soldiers clearing buildings now use techniques straight from the siege playbook, isolating strongpoints, controlling vertical space, and turning the environment itself into a weapon. The twist: today's defenders can be insurgents live streaming troop movements or civilians mapping checkpoints on smartphones. The walls have gone mobile, and the siege has gone viral. Even artificial intelligence carries echoes of that ancient battle. Modern militaries train machine learning models to predict enemy movements, much like the besieging commander studied the fortress's routines to time his attacks. AI doesn't just crunch numbers, it identifies patterns no human might spot, revealing vulnerabilities in logistics or morale. But here's the catch: just as the defenders learned too late, reliance on any system invites exploitation. Hackers already trick AI with manipulated data, proving that every technological edge comes with its own countermove. The most profound lesson, though, isn't about tools or tactics, it's about mindset. The armies thriving today are those that mimic the besiegers' willingness to dismantle tradition. When Ukrainian forces repurposed commercial drones into bombers or ISIS weaponized social media, they followed the same script: innovate or perish. History's greatest military revolutions, from gunpowder to stealth bombers, weren't just about new weapons but new ways of thinking. The fortress fell because its defenders couldn't imagine their walls crumbling. Tomorrow's wars will be won by those who never assume their defenses or their strategies are unbreakable. So where does this leave us, staring down a future where quantum computing could crack encryption in seconds, where autonomous swarms might replace infantry, and where misinformation spreads faster than any plague? The next revolution isn't coming, it's already here, unfolding in labs and hacker collectives and guerrilla workshops. But the siege reminds us, the winners won't be those with the biggest budgets or shiniest tech. They'll be the ones who look at the impossible, smile, and whisper, "Let's try something new." The moment news of the fortress's fall spread, a quiet panic rippled through the architectural workshops of every kingdom. Master builders who had spent lifetimes perfecting towering walls now hunched over parchment, frantically sketching solutions to threats they'd never considered. The siege hadn't just toppled stone, it had shattered centuries of design philosophy. Suddenly, the proudest fortresses looked like relics, their single-layer walls and straight moats as outdated as wooden shields against cannon fire. First came the double walls, not just thicker but smarter. Architects layered defenses like an onion, with killing zones between each ring where attackers would be trapped under crossfire. Curved battlements replaced square towers, eliminating blind spots where sappers could work unseen. But the real genius lay underground. Engineers began embedding chambers beneath foundations, hollow spaces where guards could listen for the telltale scrape of enemy tunnels, ready to flood them with boiling water or choking smoke. Some castles even installed singing floors, wooden planks that creaked underfoot to betray intruders, turning the very ground into an alarm system. Moats evolved from simple ditches into multi-layered nightmares. Beyond the outer water-filled trench lay a dry moat studded with sharpened stakes, then an inner channel where defenders could release floating fire barrels. The most advanced designs included underwater obstacles to snag swimming attackers, proving that even water could become a weapon in the right hands. Yet perhaps the most enduring innovation was psychological. Architects began designing fortresses to manipulate an enemy's perception as much as withstand their assault. False weak spots lured attackers into pre-arranged kill zones. Maze-like courtyards disoriented invaders who breached the gates. One castle in the Alps even featured a hall of echoes, where footsteps amplified tenfold, convincing night raiders they'd been discovered. These weren't just buildings, they were theater stages where every stone played a role in the performance of invincibility. The siege's true legacy in architecture wasn't about building stronger walls, it was about designing smarter systems. A fortress was no longer a monolith, but an interconnected web of traps, countermeasures, and deceptions. Future castles would test invaders not just with height and thickness, but with riddles woven into their very stones. Because the hardest walls to breach aren't made of mortar, they're made of doubt. Why does a battle fought with pickaxes and fire arrows still echo in an era of stealth bombers and cyber warfare? Because the siege that shattered those ancient walls wasn't just about breaking stone, it was about breaking paradigms. The tools have changed, but the human elements at the heart of conflict remain stubbornly consistent: fear, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to overcome the impossible. Modern militaries might not dig tunnels beneath enemy bases, but they're still playing the same psychological chess game. Only now the pawns are algorithms and the queens are satellites. Consider the parallels in Ukraine's defense against a numerically superior invader. When fighters repurposed commercial drones to drop grenades on Russian tanks, they weren't just improvising, they were channeling the same spirit as those long-ago sappers turning mining tools into weapons. The technology was light years ahead, but the mindset was identical. Use what you have in ways no one expects. Even cyber warfare follows the siege playbook. Hackers don't brute force firewalls, they slip through forgotten backdoors, just as tunnelers bypassed walls by going beneath them. The battlefield has migrated to ones and zeros, but the strategy remains rooted in exploiting overlooked vulnerabilities. Leadership lessons from the siege field ripped from today's business bestsellers. The commander who triumphed didn't just rely on hierarchy. He fostered a culture where a stonemason's insight could outweigh a general's order. Modern startups call this flat organizational structure, but the principle is ancient. Breakthrough ideas often come from the edges, not the top. Silicon Valley's obsession with disruptive innovation would feel familiar to that besieging army. They were the original disruptors, turning a lumbering siege into a sprint of relentless adaptation. Perhaps most timeless is the siege's cautionary tale about complacency. The defenders didn't lose because their walls were weak. They lost because they couldn't imagine them falling. That warning flashes red in every industry today. Blockbuster laughed at Netflix's mail-order DVDs. Taxi unions dismissed Uber as a fad. History's graveyard is littered with giants who mistook dominance for invincibility. The siege teaches us that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most alert, those who scrutinize their own defenses as ruthlessly as any enemy would. So when a Marine Corps cadet studies the siege today, they're not memorizing archaic tactics. They're learning to spot the quiet cracks in modern, impenetrable systems, whether that's a satellite network software or a terrorist cell's recruitment chain. The specifics evolve, but the core truth endures. Every Goliath has an unguarded flank, and every David with enough creativity can find it. That's why 500 years from now, long after our drones and smart bombs are museum pieces, strategists will still be dissecting this battle. Because while technology races forward, human nature and the art of outthinking it never goes out of style. The siege that changed siege warfare forever wasn't just a battle, it was a revelation. It proved that no wall, no matter how thick or well designed, can stand forever against the relentless tide of human ingenuity. What began as a clash of armies became a turning point in history, a moment when the old rules of war were ripped up and rewritten. The real victory wasn't just the fall of a fortress, it was the shattering of an illusion, the proof that no defense is absolute when faced with creativity and courage. This battle's legacy isn't confined to dusty history books. You can see its echoes in modern conflicts, where drone operators scout enemy positions just as sappers once mapped tunnels, where cyber attacks disable infrastructure as surely as flaming arrows once cut supply line. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Outthink, outmaneuver, and never let tradition blind you to possibility. Even space agencies planning lunar bases study this siege, knowing that the principles of defense and disruption apply just as much to meteorite shields as they did to medieval battlements. What makes this story timeless isn't the tactics or the technology, it's the lesson about human potential. Every breakthrough, from the printing press to artificial intelligence, started with someone daring to ask, what if we try something no one else has imagined? The siege reminds us that progress doesn't come from following the well-worn path. but from venturing into the unknown with nothing but curiosity and grit. So as we face today's challenges, whether in warfare, science, or everyday life, let's carry forward the spirit of those long-ago innovators. The next revolution won't come from those who wait for permission. It'll come from the ones who see the impossible and whisper, "Watch me." If you've enjoyed this deep dive into history's most game-changing siege, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of ingenuity that shaped our world. And drop a comment below. What other historical turning points would you love to explore? The conversation doesn't end here, it's just beginning.